2017 was a rather mediocre year for video games. We had some decent releases and rare gems, but now, as the year comes to a close, it seems that public opinion is mostly focused on controversies like loot boxes. So, I'm not going to talk about them. For one, the only game I played that had loot boxes in it was Shadow of War, but I never had to use them. The game handed me 3 or 4 for free, but other than that I went from start to finish without even visiting in-game market. So I haven't experienced loot boxes like some people did, which means I probably shouldn't rant about them. Secondly, this is a persistent problem with video game industry. First, there were microtransactions, now we have loot boxes and only Gaben knows what will come next. But the thing is that companies who pull this off aren't the only guilty parties here. We, the players, are too. Sure, EA are a bunch of greedy fucks who will hide Darth Vader behind paywall, but what does that say about people who buy the game anyway, despite knowing all its flaws? The only reason companies like EA can pull this shit off is because we let them, as the only way to punish them is to stop giving them money. As long as we'll fill their coffers after their annual release of well-polished turd, nothing will change, simple as that, I think. Could be wrong though, I'm not a video game journalist. So anyway, instead of complaining, I want to focus on positive things. Games I found interesting this year. Now, what do I mean by that? After all, interesting is a bit of a broad term, so let's talk criteria. The main reason I enjoy video games is their storytelling potential. Unlike books or movies, where a reader or viewer is just a passive observer of some already laid out action, video games allow the player to take part in the story, allowing for something called interactive storytelling. For example, Geralt's story in Witcher is just as much his as it is yours, and in the anniversary video CD Projekt Red released some time ago, he even admits it right to your face. Even in games that don't offer branching paths or multiple endings, simply being able to take part in the linear story makes it much better than it was, say, just a movie. Interactivity means that you, the player, have a personal stake in every event that unfolds on the screen, which draws you in far more than just being an outside observer. For that reason, I'm generally drawn to story-rich games like RPGs, but that's not the end of the list, because I also mentioned potential. Some games do not have a story and yet can act as canvas for creative minds to create histories of their own, using the game as a base. Total War series, for example, or various Paradox games. Games like this can be fulfilling from gameplay perspective, but at the same time they can act as a Lego set for your brain, allowing you to build a tale of your own using blocks provided by game mechanics. Now, all that means I have a rather large tolerance for things that most professional video game reviewers would mostly focus on. As long as the story keeps me entertained, I can overlook poor graphics and suffer through shoddy gameplay. Sure, it's nice to have a game that is competent, both narratively and mechanically, but as long as the writing's good, I can overlook some poor design choices. Keeping that in mind, the games listed here won't necessarily be the best games of this year. All it means is that, even though I played most of them over half a year ago, they still linger in my head and stand out among other, sometimes more competent games that came out this year. So, without further ado, here's Mahu's list of most interesting games of 2017. Okay, let's get the obvious thing out of the way first. Yes, Nier Automata has a certain obsession with its main character's shapely, perfectly sculpted ass. Yes, if you're not holding your hand on the mouse while running, because you're busy doing something else like, I don't know, writing a poem or fixing a car, the camera will go for an upskirt shot. Yes, you can get an achievement for staring under 2B's skirt, though she will shoo you away if you'll do it too often. And finally, yes, there is a self-destruct button that destroys lower half of protagonist's clothes, which actually increases difficulty because it becomes a bit too hard to focus. Okay, yes, there is fan service in this game, and sometimes it suffers from anime bullshit like characters talking with 3 dots or various guttural noises, but once you get past that, there's a surprisingly good story underneath all the hacky-slashy combat. Now, the main idea behind Nier isn't anything new. We had tons of books, movies and games about machines becoming sentient and questioning what it means to be truly alive, but in this case the story is well written, full of character and plot twists, some more obvious than others, and overall just enjoyable. But the story itself isn't the main reason I'd recommend this game, because where Automata truly shines is in its mood and the way it feels throughout the game, and it feels, well, sad. Now, I don't mean this as a bad thing. I always thought that games are really good at conveying simple emotions like joy or fear or anger or excitement, but it's a rare thing to find a game that feels genuinely melancholic, especially from the very beginning. Nier, however, manages it perfectly, in no small way thanks to its soundtrack, which is one of the better ones I heard in a video game, and as such it's probably the most atmospheric game I played this year. From the opening moments all the way to the final credits, and you should see them at least 3 times to get a full story, mind you, every moment just oozes melancholy melancholy. The city you move across is nothing but an empty husk of a long-gone race. Your comrades feel increasingly hopeless about the endless war they're fighting. Even your enemies, who you slaughter by the dozen, come off as lost, abandoned by their masters and forced to deal with that overwhelming dread that comes with gaining sentience. Now, that last bit is an especially cruel showstopper because, due to very responsive and fluid combat system, you can often lose yourself in the power fantasy only for it to be shattered when your enemy tells something unexpected. Almost every time when you feel like you should be angry, the game's writing pulls off a stunt like that, leaving you confused and feeling like a complete asshole. And that's good. Power fantasies are all fine and well, but we already have plenty of them around, and a game that just slaps you across the face every now and then and forces you to think is a welcome sight. But most importantly, Automata never feels like it's sacrificing gameplay for story, and in fact in some cases it actually uses in-game systems to influence the narrative. There are some misses there, like the 8-bit hacking minigame, but other than that, Nier never forgets that it's a game, not a visual novel. What's impressive here is the fact that Automata's design was, for the most part, in the hands of its creator, one Yoko Taro, which, in this age of battlefields, CODs and Overwatches, is an increasingly rare thing. And unlike most of modern, designed by the committee games, Nier is full of little personal touches that make overall experience much more enjoyable. Like, for example, the fact that you can unplug your own OS chip and die, or a tutorial sequence where you can annoy your partner simply by the medium of game settings. Little things like that are nods to the players, and it's always nice to know that creators of the game were aware that there will be an actual, living, thinking human being on the other side of the screen, and not just another wallet that needs to be milked for more money. Next on this oddly Japanese-themed list is... okay man, come on, you can say it without cringing too hard. A little game called... Doki Doki Literature Club. Okay, there, I said it. And here's the problem. I can't tell you a thing about this game. Not because I don't want to, hell I'd love to discuss it with someone, but because spoiling anything would do this game a grave disservice. It was recommended to me by someone who quite annoyingly can push my buttons to do what they want, but after playing it from start to finish, I must say it stayed in my head. So go ahead, go to the Steam store and download it. It's completely free and can be finished in 3 or 4 hours. Just power through first half an hour of anime bullshit and trust me, you will be rewarded. Just make sure you read the first message very carefully. I didn't, and 2 months later I still feel like I need a drink. Back in 1999, Planescape Torment began with player character waking up on a mortuary slab and talking to a floating skull. 18 years later, Tides of Numenera sends you off by throwing you out of a space station into the planet below. That's when you take control, thousands of meters in the air falling to the ground. You can look around to see the landscape below you, you can increase your speed and get a game over screen by crashing into the ground at terminal velocity, or you can try to slow your fall, smash through the roof of some ancient building and fall directly into your own brain. And then, once you untangle chaotic mess that is your head, you're welcomed to real world by a tattooed priest and lady who is in several dimensions at once. And that's all I should say, really. If that opening won't sell you the game, nothing I could say will. But I'll try anyway, because damn is it worth it. Torment, Tides of Numenera, is, as mentioned, a spiritual successor to Planescape Torment, made largely by the same people. It's an isometric RPG in style of old Baldur's Gate, but its main focus is the story and writing. Now, while Baldur, especially second part, was story-rich as well, Torment used to be that deep, thought-provoking game where combat wasn't crucial to success. It was also a bit of an experiment. Back in the day, most RPGs were placed in this regular medieval-ish fantasy land, but Torment went several steps further and focused on mystical Sigil, City of Doors, a place between dimensions, acting like a sort of hub between them. And the first thing that kicked players in the teeth in Planescape was that this sense of familiarity from Baldur or Icewind was gone, replaced instead by sheer, overwhelmingly creative weirdness. Unfortunately, that sense of bewilderment that separated Planescape from other games of its genre is still alive and well. Now, I know that calling something bizarre isn't exactly the best marketing practice, but today, in this age where game developers make their games safe and tame, that weirdness is a welcome sight, especially since it's difficult to not appreciate the effort that clearly was put into writing of Numenera. Almost every person, every interactive object and every location had a creative thought put into it. Say, for example, a book merchant you encounter in one of the first areas. Sure, you could make her a regular merchant, with 2 lines of generic dialogue you'd forget in half a second, or you could give her a backstory and a mental quirk that forces her to constantly talk in third-person narration. And suddenly you have a memorable character that appears for, 5 minutes in the entire game. That level of attention to details and amount of work put into to making every interaction interesting is evident through the entire game. And while sometimes it can feel like the writers were trying too hard, the quality of writing is so good that it's easy to overlook some minor flaws. But where Numenera shines the most for me is in its world design, which is a perfect mix of fantasy and science fiction. As Arthur Clarke wrote, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and this quote summarizes world design of Tide perfectly. You are on a planet that clearly saw countless civilizations rising and falling. At some point it was a part of interstellar empire, at other it was ruled by sentient monsters. Sometimes it was completely dead, and there are even some hints dropped here and there that once it might have been our world. And so it's a place full of long-forgotten technology that current, slightly backwards inhabitants treat like magical relics. Now, again, this idea isn't anything new. We had tons of games or books or movies where people run around with sword in one hand and pistol in the other, but once more it's creativity of the writers that saves Numenera from being mundane. Basically, they devised a fully operational sci-fi high-tech world, then plunged it forward in time through several millennia of hard resets. Add to that some immortal body-changing god, a bunch of well-written companions, and a kid who talks to a rock, except it's not a rock, it's a god, and you get a story that, while it has its downside, will keep you interested and immersed from start to finish. If only combat wasn't an uncomfortable, clunky, turn-based mess, Tides of Numenera could have been downright glorious. But still, it's well worth a recommendation. If a game can entertain you with a description of a toaster, you know you have some seriously good writing in there. Best soundtrack of the year. Nothing more to add on that. Pyre is a game from Supergiant Games, creators of Transistor and Bastion, both fantastic games that perfectly blended action and story, and that resume was enough to sell me Pyre even before I knew anything about it. But then, as release date came closer, things started to look unfamiliar. Instead of narrative-focused action-adventure game, Pyre looked more like a visual novel with the horror, sports thrown into it. That's when alarm bells started ringing, because, like every other nerd, I find sports dreadfully boring. I mean, seriously, what's the deal with a bunch of dudes kicking balls into nets that it encourages people to fanatical levels of excitement? And most importantly, why the hell are those ball-kicking dudes paid millions, while 2 streets away there is a hospital full of underpaid nurses and doctors who actually do something useful for the world? Once I crown myself as Emperor of the Universe, all sports will be banned. Still, seeing Pyre going in that direction was a bit weird, especially combined with visual novel-style gameplay outside of ball-tossing part. After all, as mentioned above, Supergiant had a history of games that never sacrificed story for gameplay, which is something visual novels do all the time. But as it turned out, that was just my fear of change talking, and once I sat down, with some reservations, to Pyre, I immediately forgot about my concerns, because while different from previous titles, this game still has Supergiant written all over it, which means it's good. Surprisingly good for something with sports in it. So, Pyre is essentially a game about revolution, and though it features cartoony aesthetics, ladies with wings and one-eyed worms pretending to be Knights of the Holy Grail, it somehow manages to be one of the best games to deal with the topic of civil uprising. But let's start from the beginning. You take control of a featureless, faceless, and should you want also genderless, person called a Reader. Essentially, you are an exiled convict of a theocratic oligarchy known as the Commonwealth, a nation that was once founded on principles of unity and coexistence, but over the years the ideals were forgotten, and a ruling caste rose to power by eliminating all traces of said ideals, to the point of burning books and outright forbidding literacy. Only those belonging to the upper echelons of society are allowed to read, while others must rely on their wars for guidance. That, of course, means that Commonwealth, with its myriad of races that inhabit it, became basically a police state, where ignorance is imposed by law. And that's where your character comes in. As a reader, you broke rule number 1 and learned how to put letters together to form words and sentences, and for that you were cast out into the downside, which is some sort of magical purgatory that can only be accessed via one-way river. So, the Commonwealth burned your books, kicked the crap out of you, and flushed you down their all-problem-solving toilet. In theory, a death sentence, but as you're lying down there preparing for inevitable death, you are found by... well, let me just show you the picture.
Rejoice then in your single fleeting victory.
And that's where the game begins, with you and your bizarre collection of friends trying to find a way to escape your purgatory. And man, for a place you send out those who piss you off, Downside is amazingly pretty. Supergiant's art team was always good at creating lovely looking worlds, but this time they truly outdid themselves with this cutout, semi-3D or 2D aesthetics. Simply looking at various locations is a pleasure, which kinda undermines the reputation Downside has. In most lore material you'll find in the game, it is described as a very harsh place to live, massive, with death lurking behind every corner, but unfortunately you can't really see that while you're playing. Sure, there are some lava locations or skulls scattered here and there, but other than that it's just a stunning, colourful place you could put on a travel card. But thankfully that doesn't mean too much, because unlike their previous games, Pyre is less focused on its world and more of its characters and story. I already mentioned your first 3 companions, but as the game progresses you will encounter more and more bizarre characters who will join your team of exiles, at first hoping to get out, and in the end to make sure no one will ever be cast down here again. And that cast of characters is the main reason why Pyre is so good. Thematically, they represent all races that inhabit the game world, all bound together by their exile, but aside from that they're also serving as players' main source of information about the Commonwealth, which in turn really allows you to see just how twisted the nation had become since its creation, because those people you encounter in your journey aren't exactly exile-worthy criminals. They have some quirks, sure, but other than that they're just regular people whose only crime was not thinking in a way described by their masters. I won't go into details here, I'll leave more in-depth descriptions for my top game of the year, but stories of your companions are relatable, and as I uncovered more and more information about my fellow exiles, I grew so fond of them that I was genuinely sad to see them leave in the end. Oh, that should probably be a spoiler alert here. See, Pyre kinda takes the regular party-building formula of most RPG games and goes one step further, because once you gather all the misfits you can, you are given an opportunity to free them from their prison, so they could potentially help with the revolution that's brewing back above. And that's a surprisingly good move there, because as the game progresses you get this sense of inevitable end. You might have gathered all your comrades in one place, and you might have shared some adventures together, but in the end all you want is to return to your homes and lives, and as your party numbers dwindle the game becomes more quiet. Your cart no longer rumbles with conversations, as those who still remain become more and more focused on the final goal. Even your opponents grow more distant, which culminates in the final right, which is, to put it bluntly, depressing as hell. What are the rights, you ask? Well, they're the gameplay glue that holds the story together, or the other way around. Basically, the only way to leave Downside is to prove your worth by cleansing yourself in the purifying flame. It sounds mysterious and religious at first, but then you realize that rights are nothing more than a 6-person handball tournament played between 2 groups of magical homeless people. The premise is simple. Both teams start on the opposite side of the field, with the titular pyre burning right behind them. The goal is to extinguish your enemy's flames by flinging the orb into them, and preventing your foes from doing the same. Alternatively, you can just rush into the flames with the orb, immolate yourself and wait a turn on the bench. It sounds weird on paper and is just as weird when put into actual gameplay, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. The matches themselves are fast-paced, but sometimes, especially towards the end of the game, you will need reflexes of a coke-out snake just to keep your enemies contained. Your team is varied enough that you can develop different strategies for different enemies, but as I played on regular difficulty, simple pick the fastest one tactics seem to be working just fine 90% of the time. Granted, this was while playing against the AI, but then again Pyre is mostly a single-player focused experience, and it never feels like playing with another human being is necessary. But most importantly, those rights never stop seeming like they were added almost as an afterthought, that someone in the design team realized Pyre doesn't have enough gameplay, so they cooked up this magical basketball just to put something between dialogues. And yet the sports part is so polished, so meticulously designed, that complaining about it just feels wrong. Overall, rides just provide nice, fast-paced, wonderfully sounding moments of respite from the story. And that story is, as I mentioned, the main star here, because it shifts from regular journey towards salvation for you and your friends to journey towards salvation for everyone involved, the revolution. You first learn about it about a quarter into the game, and initially you're immediately kicked out of it because nobody even bothers to ask if you perhaps would be interested in overthrowing the government that sentenced you to a long and miserable death just because you learned how to put letters together. But since narrative demands it, you raise your voice for the first time and join the ranks of the uprising. But here's the main part. You are not the hero of this revolution. Most stories would usually put the main character at the helm of a rebellion, making him or her a flag-waving, barricade-storming, Bastille-conquering hero. But in Pyre, you're not the hero of the revolution. You are its quite literal bookkeeper, and instead of clashing with armies of vile regime, you slowly and carefully help to plan an uprising that would cause as little death as possible. It's a refreshing way to look at this topic, because despite featuring fantasy creatures and magical tactical handball, Pyre provides you with far more realistic picture of the revolution than what most of us are used to. It shows planning done in the shadows, it shows how you need to slowly sway the public opinion in your favor, or simply just how many people of various professions and backgrounds you need to survive a conflict with the state. Revolutions don't begin in bars where a man throws his glass at the floor and screams for blood. That's how riots start. True uprising starts quietly, with an idea that blossoms until it's firmly lodged into the collective mind of society, because once that happens, no amount of cracking down is able to stop it. And while Pyre's revolution understands that riots are bound to happen, it doesn't revel in it. It doesn't jump at the chance of spilling blood of the vile overlords. Death begets death begets death, ad infinitum. For a game about a dogman jumping into magical campfire, it's not a bad lesson. Maybe we'll learn it one day. Okay, so now, before we proceed to the last title, some honorable mentions in no particular order. My third personal favourite this year, and first one in terms of level design. A nice atmospheric System Shock-like blend of action and story in cool sci-fi environment. Arcane knows how to create interesting locations, but this time they outdid themselves, especially with verticality. For some reason, most games seem to forget that when you are in space, building up and down is just as easy as left and right. Thankfully, Prey understands this and allows for exploration in all directions. On the downside though, as the game progresses, it kinda loses its atmosphere in favor of shooting. Okay, no, not really. I mean, sure, it has Nathan Fillion and Gina Torres in it, and that's enough to send me on a nostalgia trip. But could someone kindly explain to me why internet treats this game like it's Second Coming of Jesus? I mean, I played it, and together with this year's dishonorable mention, it's one of the games I actually regret spending money on.
Don't be a stranger, you man of danger, when so many orcs want to put their forks in you.
My second favourite game that came out this year. Why isn't it on the main list? Well, while it was, and is, an absolute joy to play, gameplay-wise, its story and writing are kind of meh. Still, Divinity Original Sin 2 is basically a pen-and-paper RPG with all its freedoms adapted into a video game form. But it has a campaign editor, so there's potential there for almost every story that can come into mind. Who knows, maybe one day I'll have to bump it up to number 1. Alright, so those were the good ones, but I feel like there is still one game we should talk about, one game that truly deserves a dishonorable mention this year. It wasn't necessarily the worst game of the year, and it didn't make me angry, but when I finished it, the only thing left was an overwhelming feeling of disappointment. I'm talking, of course, about Mass Effect Andromeda. I just don't know what happened there. I know that it was made by some secondary BioWare studio, but regardless, it doesn't explain the sheer failure this game turned out to be. Besides, who in their right mind decided that handing the best franchise BioWare ever made to some new team was a good idea? Now, sure, new blood is always nice and all, and experimentation is a welcome sight, but still, just because you make something differently doesn't always mean you do it better. Mass Effect Trilogy was great because it was focused, structured story concentrated around a small group of characters and a big overarching thread that evolved over the course of 3 games. Andromeda loses all its focus within its first hour and becomes yet another stereotypical open-world romp, but with Mass Effect name glued to it. Now, I feel like the reason for that was some recent successes of open-world games like Witcher 3 or BioWare's own Dragon Age Inquisition, but compared to both of these games, Andromeda just falls flat in every aspect. Now, I won't rant about graphical glitches that plagued the game at its release, because as I mentioned, graphics are always secondary to me, but what I will rant about is the sheer amount of wasted potential that you can see at every step in this game. It takes place in another galaxy, which is basically a clean slate for every writer. You can come up with basically anything, the only limit is your imagination. You could go for some bizarre environments or races that feel fresh and unique, or perhaps even devise a new set of natural laws for this new galaxy. Instead, we have a level list like in a Mario game. Jungle planet, desert planet, ice planet, another desert planet, and a lava planet. As for the species, we got plain old boring humanoids. I mean, come on, even Mass Effect 1 had Elcor or Hana. You see what you did, Andromeda? You made me think fondly of big, stupid jellyfish. Well done, well done. So, the new galaxy is safe and uninspired, but Andromeda's greatest crime was its story, which is just as plain and boring as its environments. To put it in perspective, I could probably recite all lines from Garrus or Mordin in Mass Effect 2, but I struggle to remember anything about Andromeda. Seriously, I cannot remember even a single bit of dialogue, a single quest, or even a single situation created by developers. And that's just sad. See, that's the point. I'm not pissed about Andromeda, I'm genuinely sad to see this amazing series brought so low by its newest installment. Sure, it had some huge boots to fill, and the combat was actually pretty fun, but the chances of it being better or even just as good as the trilogy were very slim. I knew all that, and yet still came out disappointed. Worse yet, BioWare itself admitted defeat by pulling the support from the game, making it the first Mass Effect game that won't have any story DLC. It's just the last nail on the coffin. Well, nothing more to say about it, I suppose. Better luck next time. Okay, so now for my most interesting game of 2017, and one of the first I played this year. Game that showed me that maybe I missed some good stories because I never played Japanese games before. Game that, after almost a year since I finished it, still occupies my brain, and it doesn't seem like it's going to go anywhere anytime soon. Ladies and gentlemen, Tales of Berseria. Genre-wise, Berseria is a JRPG with action-oriented combat and heavy focus on the story. Normally those two first things would be enough to keep me away, but it was that story part that piqued my curiosity. I approached it cautiously, keeping in mind Steam 2-hour refund policy, but once I sat down to it I completely lost sense of time, and before I knew it, it was 10 hours later and I was carving a bloody path through an island fortress, listening to dialogues between characters I will most probably remember for years to come. Simply put, Tales of Berseria is, to me, the best written game since Witcher 3 came out in May of 2015. Why is it so good? Well, I mentioned some memorable characters, so let's start with them. First we have Velvet, and if you thought 2B from Automata wore in practical clothes, just look at Miss Crow over here. I mean, I love the color scheme and the cloak makes it not too distracting during gameplay, but come on lady, you put way too much trust in that single clasp on your chest. Anyway, Velvet, by the law of every video game protagonist, loses everything dear to her, including her humanity. Now the only thing she lives for is revenge. Sounds simple enough, but as you progress through the world and story, you begin to realize it's not actually that simple. First, it turns out the person that did the terrible thing to Velvet, and it was terrible, no denying that, apparently did this for the greater good. And as you move through towns and villages around the world, you hear people singing praises of that person, and you see that his plan does seem to be working. There's more organization, order, people feel safer, and for quite a lot of time the game builds this doubt about who the good guy and the bad guy is, especially as Velvet commits some acts that, no matter how you look at them, can only be considered as evil, to the point that people around the world actually start to think she's a bringer of the end times. But as I mentioned, it's not black and white, and the further you go, the more Velvet's tragic story unfolds into something that is genuinely heartbreaking. Then we have Rokuro, sixth son of a family of master swordsmen from faraway land. It's Japan. When Velvet meets him, he seems like a stereotypical samurai who, for helping him find his sword, honorably pledges to repay his debt by helping Velvet exact her revenge. Except, once again, it's not that simple, and Rokuro, under his cheerful, straight personality, hides a bit more sinister side. Without spoiling anything, let's just say he's a nice play on a stereotype. He looks like a samurai, often acts like a samurai, but he's far from the noble, honor-bound warrior you're expecting to see. He's not dishonorable either, he's just extremely focused on his goal, pursuing his personal agenda with sometimes terrifying focus, and everything that doesn't bring him closer to his end goal, even things he finds interesting or entertaining, are secondary to him. Moving on, we have Aizen, my personal favorite of Velvet's insane clown posse. He's a Malak, which is sort of a cross between angel, summonable familiar and living weapon. But he's also a Reaper, which is a special breed of Malak that can only come into existence in some very special conditions and is blessed by unique powerful abilities. But those abilities have a price, which is called a Reaper's Curse. Basically, it means that Aizen is constantly plagued with a horribly bad luck. When he's around, everything that could go wrong will go wrong, and then will go even worse. This curse is nicely summarized by a coin he has in his possession. He can flip it as many times as he wants, but no matter what he does or how many times he tries, he will never ever throw heads. There's a scene around the mid-game where Rokuro gives him 3 fake coins, with heads on both sides, which leads to a scene where, despite this seemingly foolproof advantage, Aizen is still unable to throw heads even once, and this is actually one of the moments that greatly summarizes the entire game. game. It's a seemingly funny scene, but with a very dark, sad undertone, because once you're done having your laugh, you realize the sheer power of that curse, and begin to wonder what effect it has on your party. What if every single bad thing that happens to Velvet and her team is because Aizen joined them? What if he's more of a liability than an asset? More, Aizen is very well aware of that, often taking blame when things go wrong, even though nobody in Velvet's team is really blaming him. And that makes him an extremely interesting character. At one hand, he's a powerful guy who can freeze enemies in place and punch them into the ground, but on the other hand, he's also very self-aware. He does his best to overcome his bad luck, but he also realizes that his mere presence is enough to put his friends in serious danger. So at first, he comes off as cold and distant, trying to alienate everyone in the team. But as he realizes that his presence is not only valued but also liked, he begins to open up, which turns him into an extremely likable character. Because, you see, aside from all the bad luck, beating people like drunken Irishmen and overall reaperness, Aizen is also a huge nerd. And while having a terrible luck is something I personally can relate with, is that geekiness that I enjoy the most. It doesn't show immediately, but as you travel along with him, he will gradually begin showering you with facts and knowledge about, well, practically everything. You might say that he's just a really well-read guy, that doesn't have to make him a nerd, but the way he's talking about various topics, from history or geography to magic arts and fighting styles, is just a perfect definition of nerdiness. He will often start off slow, but within few sentences, whether you ask him or not, he will begin drowning you in information, sometimes practical and important, sometimes not. Sometimes it can get boring, but hey, talking to nerds is boring, especially when they realize they have uneducated casuals in front of them, just waiting to be enlightened. So, of course, quite often Velvet and gang will just doze off, leaving Aizen to his rambling, but never really interrupting him. Maybe because whenever he's in his teacher mode, he seems so happy that even hellspawn like Velvet wouldn't dare to burst his bubble, as it would be like kicking a particularly excited puppy. It makes Aizen a nice counter to Rokuro. While Mr. I have a big sword is single-minded and focused on one thing most of the time, which is also a nerdy quality when you think about it, Aizen is just interested by everything around him. And not just interested, excited. He takes the entire world with such overwhelming, almost childlike interest, I can't help but admire him for that. And because he likes being a teacher so much, he's also crucial to the story, because he acts as a main guide to another Malak in the team. But more on that later. We need to change topics, because if I'm going to obsess about Aizen some more, I will probably start writing really creepy fanfics about his buttery, glorious voice and his silk-smooth pale arms gently So, let's go to my second favorite character, Lady Eleanor Hume. Eleanor is a bit of an odd addition to Velvet's team, because when you meet her for the first few times, she is actually one of antagonist's foot soldiers, and Velvet is forced to beat the crap out of her, but after several beatings, circumstances force Eleanor to work together with her enemies. And from that moment forward, her story becomes just one huge character development arc. See, Eleanor starts as bright-eyed, naive idealist, following orders of her higher-ups without question, but during her travels she uncovers more and more of that entire plot that has been going on in the background. And she deals with it about as much as you could expect from an idealist, with shock, terror and desperate self-delusion. It doesn't help that Velvet and gang constantly mock her for her naivety, and she actually almost breaks under pressure, but it's in such moments when her character really shines. See, in most stories, when good, naive character falls from grace, they usually turn into some caricature of themselves, evil for the sake of evil. But not here. Despite her world shattering into pieces, Eleanor remains pure and kind, and stands true to her ideals no matter what. Sure, her boss might have turned out to be deranged control freak, but that doesn't mean she should stop helping people and make world a better place. And that makes her an excellent counter to Velvet, who couldn't care less about others, unless they can help in her revenge quest in some way. And after a while, especially in the second half of the game, when she becomes a fully appreciated team member, Eleanor becomes the main force that reins bloodthirsty Berserk Lady in, before she does something extremely stupid. Also, her pure character is often used as a base for game's many jokes. And speaking of jokes, we have the character I was uncertain about for the longest time, Magilu. A self-proclaimed witch and resident comic relief character. Though don't get me wrong, every teammate has some hilarious moments in this story, but Magilu is the one who takes it upon herself to always try to defuse bad situations with humor. Now, comic relief characters are almost always cringeworthy, and Magilu certainly has some annoying moments, especially in the early game when she contributes nothing to the gameplay, but as the story unfolds, she starts to show startling amount of knowledge about all things mystical, and like Aizen becomes an encyclopedia on mundane knowledge, She becomes a major guiding power whenever Velvet and team really need some serious magical help. Hell, even her humor turns out to be surprisingly well written, though it's mostly due to the fact that, after a while, the rest of the team becomes bored with her antics and just goads her into more and more embarrassing situations. So, in short, yes, she may look like a malnourished stripper clown, but without her, Velvet and her team wouldn't get very far on their quest. So even though she can be the most grating companion at times, Magilu is still a welcome addition to the team, especially when her jokes bounce off Stoneface Velvet. Alright, so I guess that's all of... Wait, no. How could I forget about number 2? How could I forget about main character of the game? When we meet number 2, he doesn't seem like a main character. Actually, he looks like some sort of clone designed specifically as bait for Catholic priests, but whatever. In fact, in the first meeting, Velvet kicks his face in and downright kidnaps him, for reasons I won't spoil because they're kind of important. Though, to be honest, kidnapped might not be the best word in this case. Stolen is more appropriate, because at the beginning of his journey with Velvet's Crazy Brigade, number 2 is barely sentient. See, he's a Malak, just like Eisen, but one bound to one of exorcists, and as such he has no free will of his own, and just acts like a weapon. Anyway, he follows Velvet's orders and keeps up with the crew, but other than that he keeps his mouth shut and contributes nothing. But then, after a while, he slowly starts to realize what's going on around him, and from that point forward, number 2 becomes the center point of the story, going through basically full character development process. At first he's like a child, blindly accepting every role and idea Velvet or others thrusts upon him. Which, of course, is a horrible thing because this poor kid is forced to travel with Magilu, who basically molests him at every opportunity, and Velvet, whose list of issues is longer than Eisen's thesis on geology. That is offset a bit by Rokuro and Eisen acting like big brothers, especially Eisen dumps tons of knowledge into number 2's head, which I think is the main reason this little guy grows so much in so little time. And of course, Eleanor is just her adorable self, desperately trying to protect number 2's innocent mind from Magilu's scheming and Velvet's unending all-consuming fury. But then, after a while, our Malak realizes he doesn't have to just accept everything grown-ups say, and starts to think on his own. At first it's just a typical teenage rebellion, but after some time he actually starts to realize value in all the advice he gets, and slowly but surely starts to form his own informed opinions about things. Now, I know it doesn't sound thrilling, but bear with me. See, this kind of character development, going from childhood innocence into young adult's fully developed mind, had a ton of potential for being poorly handled, either by lazy writing or by simply skimming along some more complex issues. But the end result is actually extremely impressive. Over the course of, say, 30 hours, Berseria manages to build extremely interesting character from the ground up, but what's most interesting here is that we get to witness every step of it. Sure, it means we get to see some angsty teenage drama, but 1, we all went through that phase, so we really shouldn't cast stones here, and 2, it's surprisingly well written teenage drama. Yes, you can't really bitch about not getting a new iPhone when there are literal demons running around trying to bite your face off. All this makes number 2, as mentioned before, a true star of this show. Now, he wasn't my personal favorite, but I understand it must have been a monumental effort to write him so well. Watching this kid grow from being a piece of inventory into, well, something much more important was a pleasure, and it's a lesson on character building for all developers everywhere. And so, it's the interactions of this bizarre crew of fugitives, and a handful of secondary characters, against the backdrop of their world that is the main focus of the game. Berseria is absolutely chock full of dialogue, both optional and crucial to the story, but I can guarantee that after a while you'll long for every single one of those little pop-ups that indicate a little narrative cutscene, because, to put it simply, the writing in this game is amazing. It can jump from mood to mood almost effortlessly, being cheerful and happy in one moment, and dark and depressing in the next, and most importantly, it never feels forced. Not to mention outstanding job the voice actors did, but more on that later. And now for the most important thing. I already mentioned how disappointing it was to see games like Pyre or Tides of Numenera foregoing their gameplay in favor of story, and when I started playing Tales, I feared that it might do the same thing. Which shows what I know, because in the end Tales of Berseria proved not only to be the best written game of the year, but also one of the more interesting ones gameplay-wise. Thematically, it's a regular party-based JRPG. You pilot your main character across semi-open maps, and should you encounter some enemies, the game will transport you into a battle scene. And that's where things are getting interesting. Although, prior to 2017 I had almost no contact with Japanese games, so what may seem impressive to me might just turn out to be a regular thing in this type of games. Anyway, moving on to combat, where you will spend most of your time in Berseria. Once you're in an encounter, you control only your first party member, with others being led by the AI, and I have to admit the programmers did a pretty good job there. as I never felt that my allies are completely useless. If anything, AI carried me through some fights, which, while embarrassing, was pretty useful. Anyway, each character has a set of attacks, and you unlock more of them with almost every level. Another good thing, because you're constantly invested in leveling up your team, as each advance affects gameplay and isn't just an arbitrary number going up. You can bind those attacks to one of the arrow keys to create a max form of combo, and while at first it may seem like an oversimplification to just press one button over and over again, once the game picks up the pace, it becomes one of its best ideas. See, each character can have around 40 various attacks, so memorizing combinations for all of them would be downright impossible, not to mention difficult to pull off in a heated combat. So by simplifying the process, the game lets you focus on more tactical aspect of planning and organizing your attacks as well as tactical movement. Because combat in Tales of Berseria is just as much about dodging, blocking and positioning, because every enemy hits like a train, as it is about punching werewolves in the face. Every attack you unlock has some inherent quality to it. Some will set enemies on fire, some will poison them, some will confuse them, etc. And each of those debuffs is useful against different type of enemy. So again, memorizing all that would be difficult, so instead you can prepare your combos beforehand to deal with specific enemies. Like, say, arrow key up will be a combo for flying enemies, and arrow key down would be a combo for taking down golems. And should something go wrong, you can always adjust your combos on the fly, depending on the situation. But there's even more to it. Most of your moves are often quite lengthy, and it takes a while for your character to recover from one animation and go into the next. But to offset that, some attacks are made in such a way that they flow seamlessly into other ones, bypassing that delay. And trust me, in later stages of the game, losing even a single second can be very painful. After a while, you will be able to make looping combos, which will turn your character into an unstoppable whirlwind of death, unless you encounter an enemy who is resistant to your loop, then you have to adjust. Now, I admit it sounds like a hassle at first, but because you can prepare 4 of those combos, you won't be forced to pause and go into the menu to change things around too often. Overall, combat is surprisingly fun, fast-paced, responsive, and most importantly, it requires a bit of thought, so you can't just mash buttons and hope for the best. Granted, my experience is based mostly on playing Velvet. She is the fastest character of the lot, and Dark Souls forced into my brain that thought that it doesn't matter how hard you hit, but how fast you can dodge. So, because all other characters are slower than Miss Protagonist, I mostly stuck with her. So perhaps combat is completely different for them and I don't even know. But while combat itself is fun, it does suffer from one issue that can sometimes grow to ridiculous proportions: repetitiveness. From start to finish, the game suffers from severe victory road syndrome, throwing encounter after encounter after encounter at you with such frequency that combat, pleasant in small doses, becomes nothing more than a chore. Say you get a quest to find some missing person in a cave, you leave town and go towards your goal, then you wake up an hour later, quest still unfinished, with you barely even reaching the middle of a cave, pissed at enemies that pop in every 30 seconds to slow you down. As I mentioned, the combat in itself is fun, but after going through 10 similar looking locations fighting 5 or 6 enemy types, you simply get too much of it and it gets in the way of the story. It's even more annoying when the game shows you some important story bit that implies that you should probably get a move on, only to put you into yet another endless corridor filled with mobs. It's aggravating at best and boring at worst, and sometimes it becomes too difficult to stay focused on the story, since the game itself seems to be abandoning it in favor of punching magical parrots. Now, of course, you can bypass most encounters, but every fight you avoid is a bag of XP you won't get, and trust me, you will need to level up, because difficulty in this game can suffer some severe spikes further down the line, so you're forced to farm those encounters or get your ass handed to you by the next boss. So that repetitiveness is a problem, but it has one, probably unintended, side effect. It makes the story and writing shine even brighter, because each time you reach a new narrative skit, it's a welcome relief after constant fighting. Alright, so we covered the gameplay, so now on to some more technical things. Let's start with graphics, because it's kind of a mixed bag. I absolutely love character models in this game. They're well designed, but not over designed, and each model clearly conveys the personality of the character. Most effort clearly has been put into main characters, but even secondaries and background ones are surprisingly well put together. The same can be said about enemies, though in most cases they suffer from Pokémon school of design, which means they're mostly just regular animals with spiky bits here and there. But while characters look strikingly good, the same cannot be said about the world they inhabit. Locations in Berseria are, well, serviceable but uninspired, to say the least. Mostly you just move around empty grey corridors or some meadows or stereotypical fantasy town. I know this game tells its story through writing and dialogues, but after Witcher 3 and Dark Souls I'm kinda spoiled for games with believable, well-designed environments that either amplify the narrative or tell stories of their own. Still, these bland environments make characters stand out even more, and since Berseria's main focus are said characters, maybe it's for the best. Velvet already choose enough scenery without some dramatic landscapes in the background. Now for audio design, which is one of the weirdest ones I've ever seen. The music and sound effects are, like graphics, serviceable but nothing besides that. Combat has a ton of cartoony sound effects and music is, well, it's there. It prevents the game from being completely quiet, but unlike, say, Automata or Pyre, especially Pyre, Berseria doesn't have even a single memorable melody in it. In fact, the best thing you could do is to turn off the music completely and just play to your own favorite tunes in the background, because that will spare you from listening to one track over and over again. See, this is that weird thing I mentioned. For some reason, combat music in Berseria is tied to your active character's costume, which means that unless you change clothes, you will be stuck listening to combat track number 1 for the entirety of the game. Now, the costumes in question are weird themselves, because they are basically the same clothes, only with different music tied to them. On one hand it's good, because you won't have a situation where the best track is tied to some ridiculous outfit, but on the other it only shows how pointless this whole idea is. And to make matters worse, those music outfits aren't that easy to find. And that would have been enough to completely bury audio design for this game if not for the voice cast. I already mentioned I liked Eisen's voice, but truly almost every character, even those who appear only a few times, is voiced extremely well. There are some grating ones because nothing can be perfect, but other than that, simply listening to characters talk to each other in this game is just downright pleasant, with voice actors doing an amazing job of conveying emotions and mannerism of each character. Not much else to say about it, it's just extremely well done, and voice actors deserve a cold beer for their performance, especially the lady who voiced Velvet. There were some moments in the game that must have been ridiculously difficult to voice and act, but the end result is stunning. So, as you can see, the game is far from perfect, but none of those issues I mentioned in these last 2 paragraphs are enough to overshadow Berseria's supreme writing. I could talk ages here on how it can be uplifting in one moment and soul-crushingly hopeless in the next, or how the characters evolve through the entire game, reacting to situations like actual living beings would, or how the story can play on your expectations and completely spin the tale around in a single moment. I could talk about all that, but I won't, because I already spoiled too much. Simply put, try Tales of Berseria for yourself, and if you enjoy well-written stories, you should feel right at home. The game starts with a bit of a slow burn, but once you're past prologue, it really picks up. Hell, it even has some life lessons for you, mostly conveyed through various characters' efforts to educate Malak number 2. Like Nier Automata, Berseria asks what it means to be alive, but it takes it a step further and also asks you much more important second question. Once you are alive, what do you live for? Are you truly alive, charting your own course through life, or are you merely existing, going from day to day doing things someone else will? But the most important lesson, hammered home by Eisen on several occasions, is this: nobody will live your life for you. And if someone tries to live your life for you, or forces you to live like they want, you should probably approach that person and knock all their teeth out. Well then, this was my list of interesting games of 2017. If I timed everything correctly, and wasn't a lazy piece of shit, this video should air sometime before Steam Winter Sale. So if any one of those games have piqued your interests, you could probably get it cheap. Now, theoretically there should be some closing votes here, but from looking at the size of the text file, I realize this video is now dreadfully long, and by now most of you probably turned it off or fell asleep. So to wrap this up, let's just hope that 2018 will provide us with some more interesting games to help us escape from cold, grim reality of our lives. And now, back to writing some very bad science fiction. I'll see you next time.